So as it is our tradition, our first question to all our guests is, what is sustainable and impact investing?
So I think I can say easier what is not sustainable investing, and then we'll come into impact investing. So sustainable investing is the investing that makes sense over the long term. And what it really means, it's an investment that works over a time horizon that is shorter than 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. And if you are going to invest over the long term, and most investments should be about the long term, then sustainability are the key metrics that would make it a successful financial investment. Now, these include the obvious things like the sustainability of the business plan, the sustainability of the financial plan, and so on. But it has other metrics, which we understand within the ESG universe. So the social impact, what does social impact mean in terms of sustainability? It means that your business within the community it works in is welcomed and liked, and therefore the regulator, the community, doesn't actually put onerous regulation against you. What does sustainability in terms of your stakeholders mean? Well, it means that you look after your workforce and the culture within your organization, so you give resilience to your organization and you have higher productivity. What does sustainability of your business proposition for your customers mean? Well, it means that you make sure that actually you're giving them something that they need and want at a price that is fair to you. What is sustainability for your shareholders? It means that you build wealth over a very long time rather than a jagged edge of wealth that you take it out. So all of these things come within sustainable. To my mind, no investment that is an active long-term investment can be anything other than a sustainable investment. And to say further, we all know about the ESG. I cannot see how you can be an investor in the long term and not integrate ESG. So that's sustainability. Impact is a little bit different. Impact is where, in addition to the normal business practice, you're trying to specifically have a targeted impact of your investment. That could be, for example, trying to have an impact on a community. You could do that in public markets and you could do that in private markets. In our own firm, I'd argue that our placemaking projects where we develop inner city areas like King's Cross have a meaningful impact on the community by providing them with new space, by providing a new space for the whole community of London, by providing employment for a poor part of the country and regenerating it. Or it could be impact in the sense of investing in things that then have an impact on consumer habits, for example, making them more carbon neutral. So this is the two differences between the two.
Very good, very good. And I know that technically as well, we talk about ethical investment and responsible investment, but I did pick up, I think, one of the many interviews that you give that, you do talk about sustainable investing is, being responsible about how we go about doing things, right? So, and I like making a difference, and I think that I share with you this bigger conversation around sustainability and then the specifics about impact. And then I like as well that the fact that everything is being responsible.
And it kind of makes sense. So one of the things that I like saying is that being good is good business. I think when we invest, we sort of forget why we invest, right? So bear with me. And I know we haven't prepared this in our previous discussion, but actually it's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Why is it that we invest? What's the purpose of it, right? If you ask people in my business, they'll say to you, oh, well, we're trying to beat a benchmark. But that's just a heuristic. Or they'll say, we're trying to create a pot for the investor that at the end of the 30 years will pay cash flow. But that also is a heuristic. In reality, the reason that we invest for the long term is because we want to, when we stop working, retire well. That's what we want. Mm. And then as a shorthand for retire well, we say that means that we have to have enough money to live well. But that's just a shorthand. What we mean is we want to live well in an environment that we like well. Well, if the world is 3 degrees warmer, it ain't a nice environment. We mean in a society that is cohesive and not fractured. Well, that means that it has to be one that doesn't have fractures built within it in an inequitable way. It means that I want to make sure that my children and my grandchildren, I don't have grandchildren, but I want to have my children, certainly for now, have equal employment opportunities. That's where inclusion and diversity comes in. I want them to be treated fairly by their companies. I want when they buy stuff to be, what I'm saying is, I want to live in a better world that I can retire in, and I want my money to get me to that world. And in the same way that I use my tax money to try to tell governments what I'd like to do in society. I can also use my investment money to build the world that I'd like to retire in. And it turns out that if I do that, and this is where the sustainability argument, if I do behave responsibly, it turns out actually financially I'm better off and my retirement is better off. And that's why responsible investment makes sense, because we don't live in an isolated bubble called the financial world. We live in the real world, in real communities, with real neighbors, in the real state.
Yes, yes. And I think it's great. And I do remember, that we were at that conversation, at that presentation you were giving, I think it was over the summer, and you mentioned, I think, Adam Smith and the philosophy. I know that you talk about capitalism and the control of capital, and in the past episodes, I have been, talking about that. So I think maybe that's another way that maybe you can share with us, what is your view of, the past philosophers, the past ideas, capitalism and this, responsibility that we have as investors.
So it's an interesting one. Let me again paint the background picture. So if you think about it, we of the income that we earn, depending on how much tax you pay, we give away a big chunk of our earnings effectively to governments and taxation. And we believe that we have the right, and that's correct, to choose how the governments use that money to shape the world that we live in. But actually the companies we work in and the companies that we own through our savings, about 80 trillion of assets if you put the developed world savings, control the other half that the government does not control, the private sector, right? Because you have 80 trillion that's direct investment, and then that includes ownership in banks and private equities and firms and so on that actually generate capital. So in reality, we control most of the capital market of the world. So we have the ability to shape the world in a way that is beneficial to us. And I want to come back to what beneficial to us means. Mm-hmm. But that power is enormous, and it can help shape what sort of returns we have and what sort of society we have. And that's where you want to have responsibility. There is a mistaken view, I think, by many, that the only purpose of the free market system is simply to make more money for the sake of making more money. It's actually based on a misunderstanding of what the Chicago School and Friedman said. He didn't quite say that, but people misunderstand, and that's what they say. And they often refer to Adam Smith, the father of free market economics, as being the person who perpetrated that. Actually, the way the free market works is that each one of us, being rational and selfish, they say, that's not what he said, but that's what the people think he said, will act in our own self-interest, and then somehow the market finds an equilibrium which is best for all. Now, I want to challenge this, and I'm glad you brought this up, because generally speaking, people in our business do not read old stuff as much as they should. And so they tend to read sort of summaries. Mm-hmm. And people tend not to have read Adam Smith's earlier works. They forget that Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, right? And the main book he wrote is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it preceded his book on markets. And this is what he says about the self-interested man. I'm afraid he was of his time, so he didn't say person, he said man, so I will stick with the gender inequality that he put in. But he says about the self-interested person, he is sensible too that his own interest is connected with the prosperity of society. Notice, not his own wealth, but the wealth of the whole of society. And that the happiness, perhaps the preservation of his existence, again, odd, right? His contentment, happiness here means contentment. The preservation of his existence, his very life depends upon what? Its preservation. Preserving what? The prosperity of society. So actually, Adam Smith is saying something entirely different. He's saying it's in our own self-interest to make sure that the society we live in is prosperous. He talks about fairness, again, talking about the way that people understand fairness. And he says, for example, upon every account, therefore, he has an abhorrence at whatever can tend to destroy society and is willing to make use of every means which can hinder so hated and so dreadful an event. Again, it's community-based. Talks about justice. All men, even the most stupid and unthinking, abhor fraud, perfidy, and injustice, and delight to see them punished. Few have reflected upon the necessity of justice to the existence of society, how obvious soever that necessity might appear to be. So here we have supposedly the father of the free market concept saying to us, for that to work, actually, morally, we have to look to the happiness of the society around us. And in fact, if you strip that back and you say this responsibility, this moral outlook on how you should behave, it turns out, in fact, to be connected with the best possible way to behave to maximize your returns anyway. So there is a misconception out there that somehow by following a responsible path, by following a sustainable path, you are giving up financial gain. And my answer to that is, this is simply not true. In fact, by sticking to the responsible path, by integrating sustainability into what you do and other factors of ESG and stewardship, what you end up doing is maximizing your financial return and building a better society, because the two are connected. And that's where people, I think, have lost sight of where we are. And why have they lost sight? And maybe you wanted me to come to that later, but this idea of difference between investing and gambling, which I think is a really interesting idea. So if you listen to the way that, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, people talk about markets, we use terminology associated with casinos and betting. We are betting on our stocks. We are betting the market is going to go up. We are betting that inflation is going to be better. Even the way that we represent markets in the media is a little bit like people talking about horse racing. So you have people talking about, and the markets have opened and they're up a few bips and they're down a few bips. Now, if you step back, actually, you notice two things. One is, it doesn't matter over the long term, because it's the long term that matters. And people tend to forget that. And you can do a thought experiment. If you lived in the UK and you had all your wealth in a portfolio which was simply the index, and you switched off the screen in 2007 and went away, and came back again in 2015, 16, and switched your screen on again, you'd have thought nothing had happened, right?
Right.
Which is an interesting concept. Of course, a lot had happened, and we'll come back to that because that's to do with responsible investing, by the way. But the other thing that people have done is there's been a lot of academic work trying to work out what people are good at. And it turns out that people who bet on markets, essentially, are bad at making returns. And studies show that the best amongst them, the best, maybe give 30% chance of outperforming the markets, right? The buy low, sell high mentality, 30%. Now, there have been also studies about professional poker players in Las Vegas who play in the big poker games. Their hit ratio is 56, 57%. So actually, rationally, if the only purpose of investing is simply to make money with no other impact, then what you really should do is not bet on the market, but go to Las Vegas, hire a poker player and give him or her your money, because that's a better way of making money. But of course, that's nonsense, because the reason you invest is you want to grow the economy that you want to live in. That's the first one. And then let's go back to this thing about, what is the purpose of investing and why it is a mistake to think about the the markets have done nothing between 2008 and 2007, because every investment you make has an impact on your life, not just on your portfolio, but on your life. So the investments you made in banks in the run-up to 2008 might have looked really good investments between 2003, 2004, 2008. The correction of the market by 2016, 17 might have looked as if you've made your money back, but you haven't, because the GDP loss and the extra debt was taken on by this country in the United Kingdom as a result of that crash, means that each one of us as citizens have an additional £16,000 of debt hanging on us because of that. So when you calculate your returns and when you think about sustainability, you have to think in terms of the total impact of your investment on how you're going to live your life. And that's why we talk about holistic returns rather than purely financial returns.
Yes. And yes, I like all the different areas that you touch upon, because I do try to, for anyone and everyone that listens to these conversations, I do like the kind of the macro concepts so that people understand, how things, what things are happening and affecting, the market, and then affecting our lives. And I think that during the points that you made, you can make people understand and be aware of how everything affects everyone in one way or another. And I like how you put it at the end, that specific 16K debt hanging on each one of us. I think that what people struggle sometimes to understand is how all the different parts come together and affect one another, right? And I personally asked you that question because I thought when you talked about it at that presentation in the summer, that it was very, very interesting to see a kind of interpretation that people can make on the loss, the loss of economy, or the invisible hand, etc., and how then it becomes a reality. And then one last point, and we'll continue with other points, but it was when you mentioned that if you went away on 2007, I think you mentioned, then came back. Maybe, and you do talk about this and a few conversations as well, is maybe on financial terms, your portfolio and your bank account will look like, actually it's been really good, decade plus, right? But there are other factors and other things that have changed completely. And that's, I think, the point that, at least that's my perception and my feeling right now, that before now and before the last couple of years, especially this year, of course, there was still, and I'm going to use a big word here, almost like a sense of immortality of the world. That all that mattered was to make money, because the more wealth you have, the better off you are, and the more you can enjoy life. But then all of a sudden we have the reality that you cannot really enjoy anything if if you cannot even move around the world, right? Which was kind of the kind of the big ice bucket in 2020. So it's,
if I may, COVID is also interesting in another way, which is it generated a debate, right? Which is an interesting debate, which is, what do we as developed societies care about? And it particularly is within developed societies, much more developing.
What is priority?
We care about the life of all citizens, including, by the way, citizens who are not economically productive. I mean, that's what pensioners are in harsh economic terms, right?
Yes.
Do we care about citizens' lives, or do we care just about pure financial economic growth? Now, societies have chosen that we care about all citizens. In some parts of the world, perhaps more reluctantly than others, because there's a tension. But by and large, most people kind of instinctively veer towards that. And I would argue that's because Adam Smith got it right when he said, looking at people, at mankind, there is an imperative, in fact, to look after your community. That is inbuilt in us. He argues, in fact, it's actually inbuilt in us as human beings. And that is how free market societies should work. And we've simply forgotten.